I'm Gareth Vaughan, a journalist at interest.co.nz.
And I'm Emmanuel Stokes, an investigative reporter with the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
This is a podcast from interest.co.nz with help from the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative. We're both based in New Zealand, but we're telling a story that has its tentacles spread all around the world to every continent you can think of. It touches countries like Sweden, the United States, Belarus, Gambia, Vietnam, Latin America, and Vanuatu. The list goes on well beyond that.
What started out as an investigation into a small business based in the New Zealand city of Hamilton offering transactional banking services has exploded into a global story with themes that edge into the weird, shocking, and, as you'll find out, the outlandish. Welcome to episode 3 of Hamilton Confidential, where we'll talk about some very interesting clients or sub-clients of Worldclear. These include a man called Michael Wilson, a convicted American investment fraudster, British citizen Gunter Klaar, who is locked up for a multi-million-dollar tax fraud in Europe,
and also a company called Odebrecht Overseas Ltd. You might recognise its name. That's because its parent company is Odebrecht SA, the Brazilian conglomerate that was embroiled in Operation Car Wash, a colossal bribery and corruption scandal. Odebrecht SA itself wasn't, however, a client of Worldclear, but its offshoot, Odebrecht Overseas Ltd, was. Now, just a reminder, Worldclear was started by Hamilton man David Hillary, and he had 2 other investors from overseas. It was set up as a New Zealand-based financial services provider.
Anything else to add, Gareth?
As we explained in episode 1, Worldclear offered correspondent-type banking services. Through these, it provided services to banks from a range of countries, helping them move money for their clients across borders and around the world. This means lots of Worldclear's customers were actually customers of customers, or sub-clients. In this episode, for example, Gunter Klaar was a customer of Global Fidelity Bank of the Cayman Islands, and some of the Odebrecht Overseas Limited transactions found in the Worldclear leak named Global Fidelity Bank as the Worldclear customer. The Department of Internal Affairs, or DIA, which oversaw Worldclear's compliance with New Zealand's Anti-Money Laundering and Countering Financing of Terrorism Act, said in a report after carrying out an on-site inspection that Worldclear relied on its bank customers to conduct customer due diligence on the majority of its high-risk customers. As we noted in episode 1, the DIA report, which found Worldclear to be seriously non-compliant, is contested by Worldclear's director, David Hillary.
And I must add, there's no evidence to suggest that Worldclear committed crimes or helped facilitate any wrongdoing by processing payments for them.
So, Manny, we've got some of Worldclear's really intriguing customers to talk about.
Yes, indeed.
So, Michael Wilson, Gunter Klaar, Odebrecht Overseas Limited. These were ones that really jumped out at us, I think, weren't they, when we were looking through the data?
Yeah, I mean, Klaar is nowadays pretty well known, right at this stage, as somebody associated with Cumex, which was a scandal which was considered to be one of the biggest sort of tax fraud cases in European history. It should be added that he was not known to be a criminal when Worldclear processed money for him, and there's no suggestion of wrongdoing. But Klaar is jailed for his crimes. So at that time, that was absolutely huge for people following financial news. And so obviously that stood out. And of course, when you find Odebrecht Overseas Limited, Gareth, I think you were quite shocked from memory.
Yeah, I was, especially the name and the timing of the transactions. It just really, I found it really quite startling. And also the fact that they went into an account that one of Worldclear's subsidiaries had with ANZ, which is New Zealand's biggest bank, of course. So I was really quite gobsmacked, actually, when I saw that. But I think we should kick off with Michael Wilson.
Why not? Yes, he's an interesting fellow.
He sure is. He sure is. So to begin with, so he hails from the town of Hamburg, which is in New York State, not far from Buffalo, the capital city, and not that far from the Niagara Falls either. So pretty close to the Canadian border, which will come in quite handy to him later in this story. So Michael Wilson was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy in 2010, so some time ago now, when he was aged just 23, and he had been at it for some time already. At the age of 21, he was taking money off strangers, supposedly to invest it on their behalf, and he had no formal investment training, so it's quite something really. He was initially accused of attempting to defraud investors out of more than US $8 million or $8 million US. And according to the FBI, he created several investment companies with names like Phantom Holdings, which kind of from this distance sounds a bit ridiculous, but anyway, that was the name of one of them, and induced both individuals and companies to invest in financial instruments with names such as leveraging agreements. And of course, he was promising high yield earnings and returns. But what really happened with his money? Sorry, his money, I say. What really happened with his clients' money?
Well, rather than investing the client's money, Wilson spent it on property, artwork, and cars, including a Hummer, a Corvette, 2 Land Rovers, and a Mercedes, and added a water slide, grotto, and pool bar to an indoor pool. So he was living the high life, it sounds like.
He sure was. And in our research, we came across a really detailed article from the Buffalo Spree, which is a New York State magazine, about him, called The Phantom King of Buffalo. And in this article, they talk about how he bought 2 properties for a combined $6.3 million. So, there's a pretty interesting story in this article about a Christmas party that Wilson held at one of these properties when he, in fact, rode a horse up to the front door. Shall I read a bit of this?
Yes, but Gareth, are you telling me that you've never ridden a horse to a Christmas party? Is this what you're claiming? Because I don't believe that for a moment.
I haven't. So this is from the Buffalo Spree. So here we go. The skies were grey and the ground damp on a late December morning in 2008. No snow stuck to the vast lawns or hundreds of trees on the 14 acres surrounding the extravagant Hamburg Lodge-style home, purchased 1 month earlier for a record-setting $3.3 million. It didn't matter. Snow or no snow, 21-year-old Michael Wilson, now owner of the region's most expensive residence, was moving ahead with the version of Christmas he'd hastily arranged for a class of Catholic schoolkids. A central part of that plan was his arrival, like a one-man cavalry on horseback. But there's more. Dressed in white and navy uniforms, some of the grade school students were petting a small herd of llamas, sheep and billy goats outside the lodge, a Tudor-style ranch that can comfortably hold 600 people. Others were occupied with reindeer hired from a local breeder. A trio of young women in red and green elf outfits arrived in a sleigh, and Wilson's attorney, working overtime as Santa, would soon hand out gifts to boys and girls Wilson had never met. And now this is really the bit that we were sort of leading up to. But first, Michael Wilson would make his entrance, tall, broadly built, and sporting a neatly trimmed square of a goatee under a black, wide-brim hat. He looked more classic outlaw than town-saving hero. Still, he rode his horse to the front door, accompanied by a triumphant Western theme pumped from the stereo of a nearby Volkswagen. He holstered his white-handled fake pistols, shook the kids' hands, and with that, the festivities in the ornament-decked great room of the lodge, home of Wilson's new frontier officers, began. Do you wish you were at that party, Manny?
I can well imagine myself being delighted by that party.
Anyway, so Wilson had a Canadian father named Thomas and his mother Rosemary, who's from New York State. They divorced when he was 17, and his father moved across the border to Canada. Wilson stayed with his mother, and in early 2007, which for those of us old enough to remember it, was a time of easy credit and house flipping, especially in the United States, just before the global financial crisis came along. He borrowed $463,794, according to the Buffalo Spree, on 4 properties that were bought for $247,600. So if you do the maths there, the leverage is pretty high.
Yes, and it's a sign of his growing sort of ambition, right? Like, he's got these assets, he wants to sort of move on to the next step, he's enjoying his lifestyle, that's what it seems like.
Definitely. So you want to tell us about his pitches to investors?
His pitches to investors included finding overseas businesses and projects needing money that were willing to pay significant interest and bonuses. Referrals and networking seemed to be the source of most of his clients. According to the FBI, there was a person essential to Wilson's operation named George Poseidus, to whom investors often spoke. Wilson and Poseidus were never on the same calls or in the same room, and there's a very good reason for that.
There sure is. So apparently the people began to wonder about Poseidus or Poseidus. I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name. Anyway, there was some concern about this guy. So Wilson organised a dinner to introduce Poseidus to his staff, the staff of his company, New Frontier. And a man claiming to be Poseidus, we're not quite sure, actually turned up. However, it turned out that this was an actor who had been hired from a talent agency for $1,800 to portray Poseidus. So it's going to quite lengths here to keep the thing going, I guess.
Yeah, because they were the same person. But yeah, it turns out that he was just using that name for whatever reason to be able to hide his true identity and his hand behind certain things.
Things sort of spiraled down for Michael Wilson, and he was raided by the FBI and eventually obviously realised he was in trouble. With his father being a Canadian, he's a dual US-Canadian citizen. And after learning that he was under investigation, Wilson travelled to Toronto. But this didn't pay off too well for him because he was arrested there anyway in July 2013, released on conditions and challenged extradition to the US in the Canadian courts. But he wasn't going to just accept his fate, was he, Manny?
No, before his final appearance in a Canadian court in February 2016, he chartered a private jet and flew to Vietnam with his wife, mother, and 3 dogs. And as I recall, this was at some absolutely insane cost, like about $250,000. Although Vietnam had no extradition treaty with the United States, Wilson was nonetheless arrested in Vietnam in June 2016 and returned to the US in December 2016 and was subsequently prosecuted and convicted.
Wilson pleaded guilty to wire fraud over his investment scam in 2017 and was sentenced to 108 months in prison in 2018. He was released in January 2023.
Yes, so what we want to look at now is where does Worldclear, this New Zealand financial services company in Hamilton, come into this story?
Well, Wilson started a Seychelles company called West Kingdom Holdings, which was a Worldclear customer. In late 2015 and early 2016, Wilson moved nearly $1.5 million through 3 wire transfers.
Leaked transaction records show Worldclear onboarded West Kingdom Holdings in December 2015 after a screening scan Worldclear had done via a compliance platform called MemberCheck questioned the onboarding process, describing how a beneficial owner for the company had been flagged as a potential high-risk customer. Wilson had not yet been convicted by that time, but it was a matter of public record that he had been indicted on multiple charges of wire fraud. His brother had already been sentenced for his role in the fraud. Asked about the MemberCheck scan, Worldclear founder Hillary said it had been referred to him for assessment and he had asked for further information, including a Canadian criminal record check that did not show any conviction. Hillary said he had incorrectly concluded that the Worldclear applicant was not the same person as the one who had been flagged. Hillary said Worldclear did not knowingly or recklessly carry out any transactions for Mr. Wilson or his company, well believing or suspecting that he was the person referred to in the MemberCheck flag or that he had been accused of, involved in, or charged with financial crimes. Hillary said that once Worldclear received further information linking Wilson to investment frauds, Worldclear did not provide any further services to Wilson, either directly or through any associated entity.
So Gareth, any more info on that?
So in the USA versus Michael Wilson court case, Worldclear's name comes up. It actually says in there that there was one transfer originated from an account at DBS Bank in Singapore, and 2 transfers originated from a bank in New Zealand by the name of ASB. And investigation by the FBI revealed each of the 3 transfers was initiated by a company identified as Worldclear Ltd. And they go on to say that they believe the use of Worldclear aided in disguising the true source of the funds transferred, and that Wilson's use of Worldclear facilitated concealing the actual source of the funds transferred.
ASB declined to comment, and a spokesperson for Singapore's DBS said laws prevented the bank commenting on specific accounts, but that it applies robust controls and takes prompt and decisive action with regards to grounds for suspicion.
And you mentioned the large payment for the plane before, Manny.
Yes.
So this money was transferred with the assistance of Worldclear to a bank account at another financial institution from which some fairly interesting personal expenses came.
Yes, indeed, Gareth. So in court filings, the US authorities said money moved through Worldclear was subsequently used to make a US $255,000 payment to a jet management service in Canada in January 2016, allowing Wilson, his mother, his wife, and dogs to flee Canada for Vietnam. There was also a $18,000 down payment for real estate in Vietnam and a US $70,000 payment to a Vietnamese real estate developer.
We've actually got some comments from Worldclear's managing director, David Hillary, from the leak, where he talks about Michael Wilson. Comments made years after the transactions were made. By way of explanation, he says while there is evidence that Wilson was a fraudster and the funds he sent through Worldclear appear to have been proceeds of his investment frauds, he says that those funds had already been successfully laundered through a bank before any of the money was sent through Worldclear. He also says by the time Worldclear discovered Wilson's true background, they closed his accounts.
What he's saying in that document is that they were basically burned, they were deceived by Michael Wilson, and that they weren't aware that he was a criminal. But certainly this was somebody who was using Worldclear, as the FBI documents show, while he was doing very bad things.
So in terms of the comment that Hillary made about the money had been laundered elsewhere before it came to us, our anti-money laundering barrister and solicitor Fiona Hall, who we've spoken with and who we shared documents with, says that doesn't mean Wilson's money was now clean.
So, I mean, what? Because they've been laundered through another bank, we don't mind that they're laundered through us? That sort of seems to be the attitude. They've been washed clean somehow by being laundered, so we don't have to do anything. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement to write in a document. You know, it's not one thing to say it maybe to your staff member where it's not recorded, but this has been, you know.
You clearly that you are really surprised that they would say that. I mean, that money is. Would you consider that money to still be dirty?
Absolutely, absolutely, still dirty. I mean, it doesn't suddenly become clean. Its origination is from crime, and that's where it stays. So.
That was anti-money laundering barrister and solicitor Fiona Hall.
Okay, so Manny, what happened to Wilson?
Well, in 2018, he was convicted for defrauding investors out of $10 million and sentenced to 9 years in prison.
He was indeed convicted, and in a 2018 US Department of Justice press release, US Attorney James P. Kennedy Jr. said despite his efforts to flee and to hide, Michael Wilson was ultimately unable to outrun or escape his criminal past. Although his fraud and dishonesty gave him temporary possession of luxury items, including residences around the globe, fancy cars and expensive works of art, the one thing that he will be able to hold on to the longest will be the bars of his jail cell.
Rather a dramatic statement there.
We should note here that there were the 2 other people who went down with Wilson of note, one being his younger brother William, who was convicted of aiding and abetting Michael and was sentenced to 18 months probation, and fascinatingly, a man called Daniel Rice, a retired Boston police detective who was convicted of aiding and abetting Wilson in the defrauding of investors and sentenced to 3 months home confinement plus 2 years supervised release. Shall we move on to Gunther Klar?
I would love to move on to Mr. Klar.
Yes. This is a somewhat different story, but also a pretty interesting one. So, who was he?
Well, he was a British hedge fund trader who was convicted of fraud in 2024 and was found guilty of swindling the Danish state out of 320 million kroner, which is about 86 million New Zealand dollars. That took place between 2012 and 2015 through what's called the dividend tax refund fraud, applications based on fictitious share trades. So he would kind of double dip, where he would get tax refunds that he wasn't entitled to, except that it was done on a fairly systematic scale.
Yeah, and he was arrested in 2019. So he's actually a dual British and Brazilian citizen, and Klar studied mathematics at Oxford University and trained as a chartered accountant. He then started working for Deloitte's tax department in London in 1997. And he subsequently worked in the tax departments of Shell and, fascinatingly, given what was to come, Enron. So for those who are old enough to remember, Enron was a Houston-based energy company that collapsed in 2001 with major accounting fraud emerging. I mean, it was a massive, massive story at the time.
Huge.
But we don't have any evidence or suggestions here that Klar was involved in anything untoward in his Enron days. But what the Danish court documents tell us is that he was involved in financial transactions at Enron from a tax perspective. He then moved on to work for the Dutch investment bank ABN AMRO. And again there he was helping optimise trades from a tax perspective. So he's a real kind of tax whiz. He, like many others, lost his job during the global financial crisis, at which point he was introduced to a man by the name of Sanjay Shah through a contact he'd previously worked with at Enron. So who's this Shah guy, Manny?
Well, he's another Brit, and he appeared on TV quite a lot. In fact, he appeared a few times in like the financial television shows and so on, kind of as the Cumex stuff was coming out, and was denying, that he had done anything wrong. But he ran the company Solo Capital, and he knew a lot about Cumex trading and worked well with security traders. He proposed a collaboration way back in 2009 with Mr. Klar, and he was in fact himself sentenced by Danish court in 2024 to 12 years in prison for tax fraud. He has appealed the verdict.
Yeah, so Klar worked with Shah until 2011, and then he founded his own company called Salgado Capital in 2012. So he then goes on to become a major player in what became known as the Cum-Ex trading strategy. So what was Cum-Ex, Manny?
Well, thank you for asking. Cumex trades. So it's a Latin term. I think it means with, without. My Latin is a bit subpar. But Cumex trades were transactions where shares were sold from one investor to another immediately before the payment of a dividend, but delivered afterwards. If that's confusing, I apologise. This created confusion over who, but it's also the point. The confusion was the point,
exactly.
Right? So it created confusion over who owned the shares at the time the dividend was paid, allowing both parties to claim rebates on withholding tax, a levy which had only been paid once when the dividend was issued. So basically, they were able to do that while people weren't sort of paying attention and making lots of money. Such trades were popular in Germany and spread to Denmark, France, Belgium, Italy, and Austria, and are estimated to have cost governments around, get this, 10 billion euros. And the trades cost Denmark alone 12.7 billion kroner, which is around New Zealand 3.4 billion. So enormous amounts of money.
So how did he use Worldclear? Well, this is interesting. He came to Worldclear via Global Fidelity Bank of the Cayman Islands, which was probably Worldclear's biggest customer, from what we can tell. And Danish court documents show Klar used his Global Fidelity Bank account to store millions of dollars that he fraudulently obtained. And the Worldclear leak shows numerous transactions from Klar during 2017 and 2018, sort of almost really using it like a personal bank account.
But he was, I mean, yeah, what was he doing? Like buying flowers, paying for school fees, stuff that you would normally do, probably for a less complex, multi-jurisdictional process. Why bounce it through New Zealand, etc. And why bounce it through the Caribbean in the first place? So, yeah, he was spending it on things that weren't like, I don't know, payroll or something, or something more mundane and work related. It was personal expenses, we can see.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, flowers, I mean, there's, thousands of pounds paid to a Manchester florist, school fees for his kids, luxury flights for his children to Sydney, where his ex-wife lived, and hundreds of pounds on designer shoes, paying financial advisors. I mean, we saw in the leak, there's he's loaned, he's made a $2 million loan to a Sharjah company, which was initially interest free, and then the one that really kind of caught our attention, I guess, was the $1 million that he sent to himself, routing it between bank accounts with addresses in apartments within the same Ritz-Carlton hotel in Dubai. So apartments 436 and 748.
You're transferring $1 million between different rooms at the Ritz-Carlton. But yeah, that was, I mean, when we were going through the data, that was something that sort of stood out, and it was certainly eyebrow raising.
Yeah, and in terms of your point about the use of these wire transfers, it doesn't seem to be the easiest or cheapest way that, somebody might want to pay for all these things. So we did ask anti-money laundering auditor and consultant Martin Dilley, and he says the question is, why would Clar do this?
That's a very good question. I mean, as you suggested, unlike the other transactions we see, it appears almost you're just using it like a normal bank account. You're paying for a lot of things that you wouldn't normally put through entities of this type. So once again, it would stand out. One, it's probably a lot more expensive to be doing it through this way, so why would you do it? Certainly some of the numbers I said, why wouldn't you just use a credit card? It'd be easy enough to charge $1,000 of flowers to a credit card, even from anywhere in the world. Why would you bother going to this ends to do it? And it really just raises the question, once again, why?
So where is Clar now? Authorities in Luxembourg said Clar is in detention awaiting trial for aggravated tax fraud and tax evasion. Requests for comment sent to his former lawyer and the Luxembourg Prisons Service went unanswered. Hillary declined to comment on Clar's transactions. Clar's tax fraud scheme was not public knowledge, and Clar was not under investigation at the time of the transactions described here. So that's Gunther Clar and Michael Wilson. Now on to our third WTF client associated with Worldclear in this episode. That's Odebrecht Overseas Limited. So Manny, what is Odebrecht Overseas Limited?
So they're a Bahamas-based company, and they're a part of the absolutely colossal Brazilian construction group, Odebrecht SA. In fact, I think it's more than construction. They're involved in a lot of different things. A huge conglomerate. And this company were caught in just a absolutely huge bribery scandal in the previous decade, where they had to make massive settlements with different authorities in several different countries, most significantly in the United States. And the United States Department of Justice referred to the case involving Odebrecht as the, if I remember correctly, the biggest foreign bribery case in history. So they're not mincing words. I mean, they were involved in, from about 2001 onwards, enormous amounts of bribery so they could get contracts, up to about 2016 when they made the settlement.
Absolutely. So the settlement came in December 2016, which is an important date for what we're going to talk about in a bit. So this was Odebrecht SA along with the Brazilian petrochemical company Braskem SA. So they pleaded guilty and agreed to pay a combined total penalty of $3.5 billion following charges from authorities in the United States, Brazil and Switzerland relating to schemes to pay hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bribes to government officials all around the world. So this followed what was known as Operation Car Wash. I'm not quite brave enough to attempt the Portuguese version of that. Manny, I don't know if you are.
Operação Lava Jato.
That's the one.
Maybe.
So this was a series of investigations undertaken by Brazilian police, which started with the probe of a small car wash in Brasilia over alleged money laundering. And it just escalated and cascaded from there.
I mean, it had enormous political consequences in terms of leading to massive protest movements. It contributed, many people say, to the eventual fall of Dilma Rousseff, who was a Brazilian president. There were several kind of senior Latin American politicians who were caught up in this and eventually saw their sort of careers truncated because of the revelations. And it just prompted an enormous amount of debate.
Exactly. Yeah.
A 2020 US federal indictment identified Odebrecht Overseas Limited as an Odebrecht subsidiary incorporated in the Bahamas, with bank accounts in the United States, including in New York. The indictment alleged that between approximately May 2010 and October 2014, and this is before they had any relationship with Worldclear, Odebrecht moved more than US $170 million off the books of subsidiaries from bank accounts in New York and elsewhere through a foreign bank using alleged sham back-to-back transactions. According to the indictment, the transactions were intended to reduce Odebrecht's tax obligations in Brazil and conceal Odebrecht's ownership of the funds. The subsidiary itself, Odebrecht Overseas Limited, has not been convicted of any crime.
So the question then becomes, where does Worldclear fit into this picture? Between June and October 2017, Odebrecht Overseas Limited transferred more than $10 million into a Worldclear account at New Zealand's biggest bank, ANZ New Zealand. Internal spreadsheets from the Worldclear League show that the money was to be transferred to a recruitment company. Odebrecht, now known as Novanor, did not respond to a request for comment. ANZ New Zealand said it could not comment in detail due to client confidentiality requirements, but that it has robust policies and systems in place to ensure it complies with anti-money laundering obligations. So again, when we spoke to Martin Dilley about this, he said a good question to ask is why?
I think the first question comes back to the whole operating structure of Worldclear. So the question is, why is a Brazilian company with a Bahamas company putting its transactions through a Cayman Islands bank that is then routing those transactions through an intermediary in New Zealand on its way to its ultimate destination? Generally with these sort of things, the more touch points you have when you're routing payments, it's slower because it has to go through more banks and it costs you a lot more. Generally speaking, with payment routing, you go the quickest route you can and the cheapest route, which is generally also the cheapest route you can. So the starting point is, well, the why. Why would this entity be doing it through here? And I don't think we've necessarily got a clear answer to that.
So we also asked Martin Dilley and Fiona Hall how ANZ should have, and probably did react, seeing transactions involving Odebrecht Overseas Limited at this time.
In terms of what ANZ seeing these transactions, now I don't think you would have put an automatic stop to them, in my view. You generally would have that for things like potential sanctions breaches, so to block a payment. Although you potentially could if it was potentially well known. It will come down to whether their screening databases were looking for these particular terms. That said, the AML Act is very much based on reporting suspicion, not necessarily always stopping it. I think having had a look at the payments that have arrived in that account, and in the context of the other activity in that account, I would be very surprised if this didn't set off alerts in ANZ's transaction monitoring system, and certainly higher risk alerts given the nature of the transactions, the size, the value, and the entities they were coming from. So I would think that would then spur an investigation on behalf of ANZ as to why that client was dealing with those entities, what those transactions were, what is the evidence behind them. But the ultimate fact is we won't know what ANZ's ultimate goal was, because if they did in fact file a suspicious activity report with the Financial Intelligence Unit, legally they can't tell us that. We can only assume that, yes, it would be very likely, given what they've seen, that the investigation should have brought up these links, and there should have been a lot of questions going back to Worldclear about the nature of these transactions.
And I think the focus there is on the word transactions. It's not necessarily the name of the customer that would have driven that initial alert. it's, in my view, more likely to have been their transaction monitoring rules, maybe around amounts and things, and that would have led them to look at the transactions, and then they would have found out the parties, and then they would have started looking even further. But they wouldn't necessarily have just had an alert out on that name to raise something, because it's not like a smaller reporting entity where they are doing a lot of manual monitoring. This won't be manual. So it's unlikely, I think, that an alert would have come up on the name, because there wouldn't have been a sanction on them as such. But I think I think the nature of the transactions would have meant they should have been looking closer at them, and then they should have worked it out.
They may have got something in the nature of what you call a bad press hit.
Oh, yes.
So potentially, if they're, once again, assuming their databases are all up to date, you certainly hope so for an organisation of that size, they may have also flagged in this as part of that. That said, I don't think they necessarily would have automatically blocked on the basis of bad press, but they certainly would have flagged an alert for investigation.
And it just depends again on that timing, because it was what you said, 2016.
December 2016 was the big US Department of Justice announcement about the settlement.
And when was the ANZ?
The transactions were through Worldclear into the ANZ account from mid-2017 to late 2017.
So still quite close. So really it was close enough probably for that bad press maybe. Yeah, so maybe they should have picked it up from that. But again, it depends on the seniority of the staff at the ANZ looking at these things and necessarily knowing, I guess.
So that was Fiona Hall and Martin Dilley. They're anti-money laundering experts who were provided details of Worldclear's transactions.
And then, Manny, obviously the US Department of Justice is an important player in this particular story. So where do they fit in?
Well, they entered into, Odebrecht entered into a monitorship agreement with the US Department of Justice as part of its plea arrangement in December 2016. And as I say, the DOJ described what Odebrecht had been up to as the largest foreign bribery case in history, or resulting in that, involving bid rigging and making bribes to politicians and business figures amounting to almost $800 million over about 15 years. And as we know, Odebrecht Overseas Limited were a subsidiary. The DOJ appointed a compliance monitor to oversee Odebrecht's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act settlement and compliance program, basically to see that they didn't do it again in the United States. And in 2020, the DOJ extended the monitorship by 9 months after Odebrecht failed to fulfill its monitorship obligations and failed to implement and maintain a compliance and ethics program.
So there we have it. Michael Wilson, Gunther Klaar and Odebrecht Overseas Limited. 3 of Worldclear's more outrageous clients.
So what about these 3 characters, Gareth? What did they say?
So we asked Michael Wilson, Gunther Klaar via his lawyer, and Odebrecht for comment. The only one we got a response from was Wilson. We asked where the funds that passed through Worldclear came from, and Wilson said, "To the best of my recollection, after 10 years, the funds related to a private metals transaction. I don't have records available to reconstruct the details." He went on to say, "I served my sentence, completed my probation, and have focused since on family and travel. I've tried to put that chapter behind me and move forward constructively." Global Fidelity Bank had its licence revoked by the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority in 2021, with its 3 owners deemed not fit and proper to hold shareholder or director positions. Questions we sent to Global Fidelity's liquidators were unanswered. And, by the way, we also asked David Hillary about these customers or clients of Worldclear's. And here's what he said.
The fact that a customer or transaction may be characterised as high risk does not support and should not be used to imply that Worldclear or I knowingly or recklessly facilitated criminal offending, designed or operated services to evade compliance controls, or acted for the purpose of concealing the source, destination or beneficial connection of illicit funds. I do not confirm, admit, or otherwise comment on your detailed allegations concerning particular customers, transactions, or business relationships.
Well, look, they're all really interesting examples, aren't they? I mean, Michael Wilson, Gunther Klaar, and Odebrecht Overseas Limited. quite stunning stories in their own right, and I think.
Yeah, and I think the question that keeps coming up, and we just don't know the answer to it, and so there's no point in speculating. But is how all of these, the Global Fidelity Bank, which was the direct client of Worldclear, brought these sub-clients to them, or how they heard of Worldclear in the first place.
Not Michael Wilson. He came in through the front door. That's
right, exactly right, with West Kingdom Holdings. But how did any of these guys find out about Worldclear? And we just don't know. So that remains an interesting question mark, and how they ended up basically moving things, in one way or another through New Zealand, rather than I don't know, some other part of the world.
So what's coming up in episode 4?
Well, we talked to journalists in Belarus and Lithuania who partnered with us on the project. One of those journalists works in exile, and they talk about the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko and how he impacts their work, and also about a particular oligarch who, in fact, moved some money through Worldclear, that's Alexei Alexin, and other people in the region.
Being a Belarusian investigative journalist means working under conditions where truth itself has become a form of resistance. Most independent media outlets were shut down or forced to move into exile, including our team at the Belarusian Investigative Center. The government labeled us extremists. It means working in exile, and as soon as you reveal your name or your face, your families will be threatened and they will be persecuted.
That's a brave and inspiring story.
It's just a completely different world, isn't it?
I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz.
And I'm Emmanuel Stokes from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project.
Interest.co.nz is grateful for funding support from the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative in bringing this project to fruition.